the rise in popularity of these funds say about the priorities of investors today?
It's showing that investors really care about where their money is going. I think a few years ago, people would just invest in something and it's like, whatever. I made money. I did make money. Whereas now people are paying a lot more attention to how I am making money and are the companies that I believe in and I'm putting my money to, how is that making an impact? And they're really looking at that. For example, ESG funds right now are at like $17 trillion of value of people putting money into those. Back in 2005, it was just like 170 billion. So we're talking more than a tenfold increase of the attention and money going into these types of funds.
What do you think's led to this change?
I think social media has led to it where we're becoming a lot more aware of what's going on. I think access prior to, let's say, 2010 or so, investing really felt more for the wealthy and really wasn't for the average person. And now the average person is, has a lot more access to it. We're asking more questions and we're becoming a lot more responsible.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, the rise of micro investing or robo investing, how has that affected? Is it made it easier for people to invest in ESGs?
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. They're easier to find, easier to research, and then it's really just a push of a button that says, look, I believe in these things. Go put my money into those things. I think that's been a huge driver.
How can a company qualify to be part of ESG? Like, who's making those decisions? How do you qualify and how do you, if you like, how do you change, to become like, okay, I'm eligible again, and who decides? Yeah.
So the people that decide these are called fund managers, and there are dozens and dozens of different ESG funds, and they all have their own rubric, if you will. And what they do is they come out with that rubric. They kind of give each company a score. And if you meet a certain threshold, that's how you become added to one of those ESG funds. So they look at each of those three sectors. They say, look, you're paying people equally. That's great, but you don't have diversity. Therefore, you lose a point here. So improving in those three sectors and those three areas can improve a company's ranking. And once they hit that threshold, they'll be added to one of those funds.
So basically, like, just to break it down, because my show is basic and for me as well. So ETFs are funds where it's like a mutual fund, or like, so instead of going and investing directly in Apple or directly in Home Depot or something, you're investing in funds that have multiple companies involved. And so sometimes when you invest in those, you might not necessarily know the entirety of what's in that fund. You just know that me, might just like, be like, okay, this seems like a good fund, but I haven't necessarily looked into exactly what this is about. I just know that this is a fund that will protect my money and grow. Versus like now the ESG they're not individual companies. They're individual funds that are deciding which companies qualify to be in their fund based on these metrics, right?
In a way. So let's just take a regular ETF. For example, SPY. That takes the top 500 companies in the US. To qualify, you just got to be one of the 500 biggest companies. That's it, right? And ESG will say, okay, well, of these 500, which one of these rates the highest for environment, social, and governance? And they'll take a section of that, and that will be the fund in and of itself. So that's how they really work. So they're really taking everything that's out there and grading them and saying, here are the top 50 who rank the highest in terms of social mobility, in terms of how they're spending their money and how they're treating employees. So it's really a subset, I would say.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So is it better for your money to invest in them? Because I've been doing so much research, and like I've seen arguments pro and con, and it's like the consensus seems to switch all the time. And also depending on like who politically you're talking to. I remember a long time ago, a friend of mine was saying, oh, I had all these stocks and funds. And then she's like kind of a wealthier person. And she said, I went to my manager, wealth manager, and I was like, hey, can we invest in only stuff that isn't like evil? And the guy was like, oh, you want one of those, rather than like the default being that. So in my mind, when she told me that years ago, it stuck with me that the evil funds are the ones where you make money and the ESGs are the ones where you don't. But so they, someone who's managing your money will be like, well, obviously you care about being rich. So but like, then I now see people saying, well, actually ESGs can actually make you just as much money. And it's so like, you smiled when I said that, but like, yeah, what do you make of all of this? Cause I feel like it changes every time I read something.
You're right, because there is a flip. Like I feel like every 2 weeks is like, oh, they can actually get you the same or better. In other cases, like, not really. But the truth is they've actually been around since the 1970s, which was something that was news to me. It is not something that just popped up out of nowhere. But generally, you're going to get right around the same. Most studies would suggest, and that's because you can also see a lot of overlap too. For example, a lot of those major index funds invest in companies like a Microsoft and an Apple. Not surprisingly to some, those two companies tend to end up on a lot of these ESG lists because they pay employees well. They usually lobby correctly, if you will, depending on who you ask. So because they make up so much of both sectors, in many cases, not all, you're going to get the same performance. And if not, it's going to be just slightly off depending on which funds you have.
So it's interesting that these have been around since the 70s. And it's interesting that like you have to ask specifically for the nice guy fund, you know?
Yeah.
And what? Oh, go for it.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's interesting, and going back to the studies, it all depends on like what time frame you're looking at. So, for example, many ESG funds for years did not include oil companies, which were pretty terrible in terms of like return for investors. Really from like 2010 to about 2020, they weren't good. So by default, ESGs looked amazing during that time because you really cut off an entire sector that, one, was not environmentally friendly, and then two, did not make a lot of money for investors. So there are a lot of cases where you can make the same, if not more, money with ESG funds.
It just depends on what's going on at that time.
Yep.
And so with ESGs, like we're talking about, a judgment, ethically and morally that perhaps, I don't know why someone who believes otherwise would be listening to this show, although maybe just for fun. But like, how did they decide the metrics? Like, it seems like you would say, oh, these metrics are very like liberal, leftist. Yeah,
some people are always going to have that criticism. The thing about it, which, there are areas in the ESG space that I have personal beefs with. But for example, you do have to read the description on how they grade those companies, because I've been in some spaces where I saw Wells Fargo that was inside of an ESG fund, and I'm not with Wells Fargo like that. There are some that will exclude entire sectors, which sometimes can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. I think the most important thing is, as an individual, you want to say like these are the things I believe in, and then find the fund that has that type of criteria, and then really see how closely you can match the two of those things.
Yes. Okay. So it's not one size fits all. There's not like one ESG fund. Just for people who are listening who really, this is their first time hearing about this. Like we've done episodes on impact investing, which kind of sounds similar, if not the same. But what, if someone wants to prioritize this, like how do they start looking for ESG funds, and how do they start looking for, like, specifically, where do you find them, and how do you parse through what's in them? Yeah,
so the easiest way, I think US News has a list of popular ESGs that you can kind of thumb through. I would start there. But the thing that you really want to pay attention to is anytime that you go and look into these ESGs, you can either do this on Yahoo Finance, or you can go to the website itself, look at the top 10 holdings of it. And there's usually an option to either download the list if you want to go that deep into it, where it'll show you every single company that is invested inside of that ESG. And that gives me a good indicator of how sound how I feel about the company. And again, you're going to have to draw a line for yourself. So for example, the fund that I was mentioning earlier, it had like 0.25% of the money inside of Wells Fargo. So I had to draw a line. Is it, is that tiny sliver important enough for me to say no to the entire thing? Or is that something that I'm just going to deal with it compared to something else? So you always want to take a look at what is the criteria, what companies are in there, and then whether or not that meets the threshold for your personal values.
What's your beef with Wells Fargo?
Well, I'm glad you asked.